By the late 1800s, segregation laws became a well known part of the South. People of color were separated from whites in schools, restaurants, and other public settings. By the mid 1900s, the conflict worsened. The issues regarding segregation laws and civil rights for blacks in the South had taken a toll on the most innocent individuals in society, their children. In 1951, a third grader named Linda Brown walked many blocks to catch a crowded bus, transporting her and other children to a Topeka, Kansas elementary school only for black children. On behalf of his daughter, Oliver Brown filed a case against the Kansas School Board of Education. His case, along with other similar cases in the Supreme Court, would challenge segregation laws and eventually change the South. Although doctrine creating separate but equal was in place from the Plessy v. Ferguson case, deteriorating conditions in black elementary schools did not allow the same education as the white schools in the same neighborhoods. Many black schools were overcrowded and lacked resources to help the children to succeed. Segregation inflicted many headaches and heartaches upon people who lived in that day and time. For almost 100 years, segregation followed the Civil War, leaving blacks to struggle generation after generation. However, Brown v. Board of Education would solve part of the segregation epidemic in the United States. Homer Plessy, a black man from Louisiana, was denied his first class ticket to ride in a whites only rail car on the East Louisiana Railroad. He challenged the constitutionality of the segregated railroad train, saying it violated both his rights to the 13th and 14th Amendment. The case would be denied in the state courts and prevail in the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld the state racial segregation laws for public facilities under the doctrine separate but equal. In the eyes of the law, segregation was not unconstitutional because it did not violate the equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. As a result, it became the conflict of the century. Racial segregation became a way of life for people in the South and more intolerable to those who lived elsewhere. Blacks began to realize the injustices of the South would likely spread. Following the Plessy decision, restrictive legislation based on race continually expanded, and his reasoning was not overturned until Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. Linda Brown became a significant part in history as a third grader in Topeka, Kansas. Every day, Linda Brown would take a bus 5 miles to Monroe Elementary School exclusively for black children. Just several blocks away from her home was Sumner Elementary School, a school only for white children. Not only was the school much closer to her house in Monroe, it offered her a better education and experience. However, when her father, Oliver Brown, attempted to enroll Linda into Sumner, the school's principal wouldn't allow him to do so because of the color of her skin. Brown went to McKinley Burnett, the head of Topeka's branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and then attorney Thurgood Marshall argued their case along with similar cases in different states under Brown v. Board of Education in the Supreme Court. In preparation of the case, Thurgood Marshall, Harold P. Ballware, and Spotswood W. Robinson III, the three lawyers working on the case, gathered to discuss a strategy that would end public segregation. Their goal was to overturn the ruling of the Plessy v. Ferguson case and for doctrines separate but equal to be deemed unconstitutional. They hoped to force the Supreme Court to declare that even if the compromise was equal in other ways, segregation itself was unconstitutional. The NAACP argued to the U.S. District Court that segregated schools were inherently unequal because they denied many opportunities to black children. On the other hand, the Board of Education defended its position, arguing that segregated schools prepared children for adulthood. However, the judges failed to look past the precedent of Plessy v. Ferguson and ruled in favor of the Board of Education. Brown and the NAACP appealed the decision immediately. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the unanimous ruling that racial segregation in public schools violated the Constitution. 1 year after it was determined that the separate but equal doctrine was unconstitutional, the court reconvened and decided how the decision would be enforced. Just over 1 year later, on May 31st, 1955, Warren read the court's unanimous decision, now referred to as Brown II. A compromise was established, instructing the states to begin desegregation plans with all deliberate speed. As more blacks began to attend all white schools around the nation, there were outbreaks of riots and protests from white people who were against integration. The first major attempt of desegregation was in September 1957, which took place at Little Rock High School in Arkansas, which drew protests from many townspeople. President Eisenhower was forced to send in 1,000 paratroopers to escort the 9 students into the school to protect them from outraged protesters. Although, in this situation, no one was hurt, many other events led to brutal violence that would continue throughout the era. Following the case and the decision, schools around the nation began to integrate, and states compromised for blacks to attend the white schools that were in their residing neighborhoods. Many people of the black community felt a sense of power and recognition of importance to society that had long forgotten and ignored them. Following the case, Linda Brown lived on to become very successful, attending Washburn and Kansas universities, and has continued to speak out on segregation. In 1979, she reopened the Topeka case with the American Civil Liberties Union, arguing that the district schools still were not desegregated. Eventually, it was ruled by the Court of Appeals in 1993 that the school system was indeed still racially divided, and 3 new schools were built as a part of the integration efforts. Linda Brown and many other black children across the country were able to attend the school of their choice because of the conflict that racially segregated schools were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court made a compromise to accommodate the black children, hoping they would become successful adults in society. The decision did not just help end segregation, but it helped many citizens in the South realize that change was needed and was going to transpire. Brown v. Board of Education, now acknowledged as one of the greatest Supreme Court decisions of the 20th century, unanimously held that the racial segregation of children in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This case would stimulate the NAACP and spark the Civil Rights Movement. Brown v. Board of Education, separate but not equal.